Okay, so for this one, we are looking at this arrow right here, which is in between 0 and 1/10. And we have 10 jumps to get to 1/10. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? We have 10 jumps to get to 1/10. Now, what I like to do to make it a little easier is add a 0 after the end here. So now we're looking at, rather than 1, we're looking at a 10. So we know that each jump is worth 1/100th, right? So there's 1. Okay, so now I've labeled all the spots on this number line by hundredths because the whole thing is 1/10. And I know that it takes 10 hundredths to make 1/10. So I've labeled them by hundredths, so 100, 200, 300, 400ths. So the spot where the line is 0 and 400ths. Same thing happens here. We have a 0 and 1/10 at the very end. So I'm going to go ahead and put a 0 after it like this. So now I'm looking at in between 0 and 10. And again, I have 10 hops to get to 10. So each hop is worth 1/100th because I know 10 hundredths equals 1/10. So I'm going to go ahead and label my number line starting here at 0 and 100th, 0 and 200th, and so on. Alright, so after labeling this number line completely, I was able to see that the arrow is on 0 and 600ths. So I would put 0 and 600ths. Here, I have 0 on one side and 5/10 on the other. So I'm going to do my trick again, and I have 0 and 50. Now these big lines right here, I have 4 of those, right? So I have 5 big hops to get from 0 to 50. Well, it makes sense to me that each hop would be worth 10, or 1/10 really in this occasion, because 10 times 5 is 50, and I have 5 hops. So if each hop is worth 1, that means, or 1/10, that means the arrow is in between 1/10 and 2/10, or 10 hundredths and 20 hundredths. So we can go ahead and separate that even more by looking at how many spots there are in between there. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there's 10 total jumps to get from 10 hundredths to 20 hundredths, which means each jump is worth 1/100th. So I can go ahead and label those. Now it's too small for me to label them, so I can count. This is 10 hundredths, so this would be 11 hundredths, 12 hundredths, 13 hundredths, 14 hundredths, 15 hundredths. So the arrow is pointing to 15 hundredths because we found that the arrow was in between 10 hundredths and 20 hundredths, and there were 10 jumps to get from 10 hundredths to 20 hundredths. So that means that each jump was worth 100th. So we said 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So the decimal that we landed on was 15 hundredths. Next up, we have 4/10 on one side and 5/10 on the other. It's a little bit difficult, so I'm going to go ahead and add a 0 to either side. So now I have 40 hundredths and 50 hundredths. And now it's easier for me to see that if I skip here, each skip is worth 1/100th because I have 10 jumps to increase by 10 hundredths. So I'll go ahead and label those. Alright, now that I've labeled my number line, I can see that the arrow is on 0 and 46 hundredths. So my answer is 0 and 46 hundredths. Right, and I found that out because I added 1/100th each jump that we went, because I had 10 jumps to increase by a total. Alright, here we're in between 3/10 and 4/10, but to make it easier, I'm going to make it 30 hundredths and 40 hundredths. And as you can see, I have 10 jumps to increase by 10 hundredths. So each jump is going to be worth 1/100th. So here would be 31 hundredths, 32 hundredths, and so on. So I'll go ahead and label my number line now. Alright, so now that I have my entire number line labeled, I see that the arrow is pointing at 37 hundredths, right? So my answer is 0 and 37 hundredths. Alright, here we have 1/10, 3/10, and 5/10. But we have big markers in between, which tells me that it would be 1/10, 2/10, 3/10, and this would be 4/10. So now I can easily see that my ant is in between 1/10 and 2/10. But to make that easier to work with, I'm going to change it to 10 hundredths and 20 hundredths. And then I'm going to label each spot because they go up by 1/100th each time. So this will be 11 hundredths, 12 hundredths, 13 hundredths, 14 hundredths, and then 15 hundredths. So the ant is standing on 0 and 15 hundredths. Finally, we have this guy. He's in between 4 and 5. And we see here it says 4 and 3/10, so I could rewrite that as 4.3. And so I know that it's 4 and 3/10 after 1, 2, 3 hops. So that tells me that each hop is worth 1/10. So I could go through and label my line 4 and 1/10. This guy is 4 and 2/10. So this would be 4 and 2/10. Right, now notice how I put the 4 in the front because this decimal is in between two whole numbers. If I were to have just put 0.2, that would be incorrect because 2/10 is not in between 4 and 5. However, 4 and 2/10 is in between 4 and 5.